Okay. Not sure if we have anybody in here yet, but we're going to start our lecture here for Shading and Lighting 2, Week 2. And basically, we're going to be going over a couple different things. Probably not going to be doing as much in Maya for this one, since we just kind of wrapped up our Maya project with Activity 2.1. The main thing we're going to be doing for this live session is actually going to be all about Photoshop. So we're going to be going into Photoshop, creating some textures. I'm going to show you some different ways we can use UV maps, which are kind of a new concept for all of you guys. How we can use UV maps to place textures in their correct location. And we're also going to be going over some other texturing techniques like making tileable, repeating textures, how we can kind of do some more complex layering inside of Photoshop. And one of my favorite things we're going to be talking about is masking. And I know like Photoshop's kind of a weird topic for me to talk about because Photoshop is a really polarizing software for a lot of people. Not because it's really difficult, but a lot of people have there's a lot of varying comfort levels with the software because it is such a popular one to use. A lot of people coming into this class have already used it extensively. You may have had classes in high school possibly, or like another college where you'd been using Photoshop. We've had plenty of people coming in that have done graphic design before, or even just like simple concept work in Photoshop. So if you are familiar with it, this may be some review from things you've already learned. But if you are not that familiar with Photoshop, this could be all new. So everything we're doing is still fairly simple. One of the projects for this week is definitely a little more complicated when we do get into the masking, but it's not going to be anything too crazy. So what I'm going to do, if you guys want to, if you have questions, you can always shout it out. You can just let me know, in the chat, or you can just let me know who's here, because I have no idea who's watching. All right, what we're going to do is let's actually start with the original project. I'm just going to copy this on the desktop just so I don't mess up the one you guys are using. And just to do a kind of a quick recap where everybody should be at this point. In the first week we're doing a lot of like material presets using the preset browser. We were doing some Pixar surface assigning on some of the other objects for that other vehicle project. And then 2.1, which is the beginning of the environment project, you guys were assigning some material presets to a couple of different pieces in the project and also getting into some very basic texture assigning. Hey Luke, how's it going? So you've already created and assigned materials, and you have got to the point where you've found some textures. Now, the thing that's going to make this one a little more unique and different is that instead of us just going onto Google and just like hoping we find the perfect photo and just slapping it on the material in Maya, there, of course, are going to be plenty of cases where something we need to do in here is just not on Google. We want to be able to control the texture. We may want to add dirt. Maybe there's something wrong with the texture where it's almost perfect, but there's like a highlight in it that we want to remove, or there's there's some stain, maybe like on the, let's say we're just doing like a sandstone. Maybe there's a weird stain pattern on the sandstone that just doesn't quite feel right. But there are ways to clean this stuff up. So it's going to be some really subtle texture modifications just to get the correct final result. And later in the month, we are going to show you guys something else, which I'm really excited to show you about, which is called Substance Painter. And Substance Painter is probably one of my favorite softwares. It's, I guess, sort of similar to Photoshop in the sense that you are creating textures, but Painter, if you've never seen it before, you're actually painting physically on the 3D model, and you're creating materials, not just textures. And the main difference, by the way, between a material and a texture is like a two-dimensional image, like it's like a file. Anything could be a texture. This image could be a texture if I put it on something. Let me bring that back. But a material uses textures. So a material defines how the surface uses the texture and reacts with light. So for example, like in this one right here, the material would be this kind of shiny polished wood. And our material would be, this gold right here is creating like gold colored specular reflections. The texture is the wood grain itself. It's the wood grain on this wooden material. So they're a little different. Okay, what I'm going to do is go in here. We're going to do the same routine we've been doing for quite a few weeks now. Let's set our project. So we're going to go to File, Set Project, Desktop, and there's my environment project set. I don't know what that's about. We're not going to worry about it. It's probably nothing. We'll go to the scenes and open this up. And everything should be pretty much good to go. The file I'm opening doesn't have any of the adjustments that a lot of you have already done. If you're in Shading Lighting 2, I don't have the telescope with materials yet. So if I do a render inside of here and just look at it in the viewport, it's probably just going to be primarily gray. Yeah, it's just gray at the moment. If we wanted to, we could like slap some materials on here pretty quick, but we're not going to worry about that. So let me show you guys the kind of goals here. So there's going to be two parts. We have our using UV maps with Photoshop, which we're going to cover. And we're going to probably get into this one a little bit. I'm going to do part of 2.3, probably the harder part, just so you guys can see me work my way through the most complicated part of the week. We're going to start with one of the easier ones first, using UV maps with Photoshop. So our main goal with this is to show you guys what UVs are. It's a part of a model you probably haven't been exposed to yet, or if you have, it's been very, very brief. So we're going to talk about UVs, how we can use them, and then we're going to take these UVs out of Maya and then use that as like a guide inside of Photoshop. Because when you're putting a texture on something, really the key thing to kind of understand here is that a texture is a two-dimensional image, right? So it's 2D. It's just U and V, or I guess we think of X, Y, Z. We can also say it's X and Y. It's a two-dimensional image. Models are three-dimensional. So there's a discrepancy there where if we say that, maybe we've done this really cool, like embossed sort of like normal map or some type of texture that's kind of creating like a logo on the front of this little post right here. Well, how do I know, like when I make an image in Photoshop, where this is going to line up inside of Maya? Like there are ways to move things around inside of Maya, but generally what should happen is if you line it up properly in Photoshop, you shouldn't really have to worry about aligning things inside of Maya. It should just kind of end up in the right spot right from the beginning. And this is really where UVs come in. So I'll show you a couple examples here. Like if we look at, I guess we'll just look at these posts right here. And you're not really going to be changing the UVs for these guys, or really any of the objects. I kind of did the UVs for you, but I do want you to see what they look like. Okay, so what I'm in right now is this thing called the UV editor, and there is a way to get to this if you like using the UV editing workspace. I was using it before quite a bit, and I actually use it in some of my videos, but for today we're not going to worry about changing the workspace. We're going to keep it simple. I'm just going into UV and opening up the UV editor. It's just a separate window in Maya. It's sort of looks like a giant grid. I'm just going to use Alt middle mouse to move around. Alt right is zoom in and out. So between Alt middle and right, you're basically, and Alt left also moves around. You can kind of move around however you want in here. But the main thing is that you'll notice that when I select something inside of the 3D scene, that things change in this little part of the grid right here. So this is where we're modifying our UVs and where we're keeping information. And if you look at the grid, it's a little hard to see because the numbers don't really scale, but it is 0 to 1. So 0 to 1 across, 0 to 1 vertically. So if you kind of think of just very simple, graphs that you guys have probably done before, it's kind of what we're looking at. It's just a one-to-one coordinate system, 0 to 1, positive crossed and vertically. This little pocket right here is where we're going to be putting all of our UVs. Now, a lot of these are already finished. A couple things, though, like if we look at the pedestal, here's a bit more complicated object. So it's broken up into 3 pieces, top, bottom. And you can see individually these are the same thing. I just have them separated into 2 chunks. Then we have this little post right here in between the 2. So this makes up that guy. And then over here, we have this one. So if I hold shift and click on all these different pieces, as long as this window's open, you'll see the UVs show up. And just to kind of show you kind of what this looks like for one section, the way to kind of visualize how UVs work is if you take this three-dimensional shape, imagine like if this was made of paper, like it was just sort of a piece of origami. If you know where to cut it with scissors, and like if you had a knife, like a scalpel or a blade, and you started like cutting some of the corners, obviously this three-dimensional piece of paper would eventually lay flat into a bunch of smaller flat pieces of paper, right? So you're sort of trying to kind of take a three-dimensional shape and turn it back into a two-dimensional shape by cutting it up into the bits and pieces. Now, UVs are components, so just like you guys have seen before, where I've held down my right mouse button and we've gone to like edge mode. Typically we're in object mode by default, but if you go to like edge mode, these are edges, right? You can double click and do an edge loop and move things around. There's vertex mode. So vertex are the points around what's called a face. So these are all vertices. And again, these can all be moved. You can grab points and move them around however you want. We've also got face. Face is kind of the big one that most people understand. It's the gap, or the space between the edges. So these are all faces. But collectively, edge, vertex, and face all really work together. They are the sort of building blocks that give you the full object. But face, edge, and vertex are all something in three-dimensional space. They're all sitting in different coordinates in 3D, X, Y, Z. UVs are different. So UV, you can still get to it here if I go to UV. And if I click on a UV, you'll notice it looks really similar to this guy, vertice, right? They're the dots in the corner. Now what's different is UVs are specifically talking about how they're laid out right here. So you can also right click and go between the different components in the UV editor. But if I go to UV mode and if I start clicking on things or marquee selecting, you can see we're selecting all the little dots. These light up green as opposed to yellow with vertices, but it's still basically the same thing. But these are referring specifically to the two-dimensional points that make it up in the UV editor. Now there is one other thing that kind of goes along with UVs, which is called UV shell. And a UV shell is if I hold my right mouse button down in the UV editor, this doesn't actually happen here. Well, sorry, it does there, I guess. But it's not kind of on the main section here. UV shell is the whole group. So sometimes when you're like cutting this up into pieces, there's a lot of cases where it's just impossible to get the whole thing to still be connected as one piece. Sometimes you do have to like cut the top. So this is separated. And then this part right here is like the side and the underside. That's like the cap to this thing. That's the piece going around. So you kind of have to make compromises when you're UVing to get it to break up appropriately so you're not getting weird stretching. You have to kind of know where to cut it so you get seams in the right location that maybe aren't too visible from the camera. So it gets pretty complicated with a lot of the tools, and this is its own kind of specialty, just knowing how to do this stuff. But anyone that gets into modeling, environment modeling, character modeling, prop modeling, modelers are typically the guys that do the UVs. And depending on the studio you go to, the modeler could be doing the textures as well. It could all be in the same department. So you might be doing the model, the UVs, and the texture. Or it could be a situation where you do the model and the UVs, and then you hand this off to a completely separate artist that is doing only the texturing and the surface properties, the look development. But again, it's all set up for you guys. You're going to have a class or a couple classes where we break the UV process down in way more detail. If anybody actually does get into UV mapping, though, and you want to learn more, definitely reach out to me. I've been teaching UVing for quite a while, and I personally love UV mapping. To me, it's like a puzzle. I like figuring out how to break things up into different pieces, so I really enjoy it. It's not for everybody, but if you do find joy in UV mapping, once you get to that point, you will be well needed in the industry because most people do not enjoy doing this. It seems very tedious, and if you can find the joy in doing that, studios will love you, especially if you do it well because you're doing the dirty work that a lot of people don't want to do. So our main goal here is once we know, generally what UVs are, and it's kind of the brief overview that we've already gone over, but once we sort of know what we're doing, we need to get these UVs out of Maya. So I've already selected all the objects for these. We open the UV editor. I just need to save this out as an image so I can use this in Photoshop as a guide so I know where to put my texture. Because what I'm trying to do is get the texture, like certain types of stones, to hit certain parts of the object. And without having the UV map, if I was in Photoshop, I really wouldn't know where to put anything in order for it to look right in Maya. So how do we get this out of Maya? What you need to do is first off, make sure that you are selecting your objects. And I want to show you one issue that does come up with this activity. You guys have learned about groups before. Now, the pedestal is in a group. There's objects inside of it, but there is a group. If you have the group selected, it actually won't allow you to export the UVs. They might fix that at some point in a future update, but up until now, you haven't been able to do it. It doesn't understand what the group is, and it kind of throws an error. So just be careful about that. Just take the time to hold Shift, just click through the pieces you need. It's only those 6 pieces. 3 here, 3 here. Once you have verified, oops, you have to have the UV editor open. That's kind of annoying. Let me do that again. Once you have verified that it looks like this, we got to save the image out. So it's pretty easy, honestly. All you have to do is go up here to the little camera button. This is a UV snapshot. We're going to click it. Little window is going to pop up. And it's kind of similar to like saving an image or saving a project. It says, hey, where do you want to put it? What's the file format? What resolution do you want to use? It's going to be fairly easy here. So it goes to desktop. It's going to the folder. Now, currently what it's doing is going in the source images folder. And I'm going to show you guys a couple ways to, oh wait, actually let me do something real quick, because I think this project actually has a couple things already in it. Oh, I must be going to the wrong folder. Okay. So right now in source images, there's not really much in here. They have a cloud image for like the sky behind the camera that's lighting the scene, but there isn't really much here. What I want to do is start organizing stuff. So we're going to make a folder in our source images folder. So this is in our project directory. We're in source images where we put textures. Right click. We're going to go to new folder, and we're going to start keeping things in groups. Kind of like we've done with grouping in Maya. We're using the folder as a way to group things together outside of Maya. So we're going to call the first one, let's do pedestal textures. Now there's a couple other things we're going to probably get to here. The project also needs us to do a wall texture eventually. So if we wanted to, we could knock that out. Wall textures. Right click. We're going to do one more here for the balcony textures. I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit because we haven't talked about the balcony and the wall yet, but I'm just setting up the folders because it's part of the activity. So I'm getting folders set up, and inside of like the pedestal, this is where we're going to put the UV image we're going to save. And when I'm done with Photoshop, this is also where my saved texture from Photoshop is going to go, as well as the Photoshop document, like the .psd. So I'm trying to really keep everything together in one section, so it's very easy for me to find stuff again later. All right, so we're going to hit Browse, Desktop. I think I was going to the wrong folder actually previously, so we're going to go in Source Images, Pedestal Textures. This is perfect. We don't need to really change anything here. Probably just name it. So let's call this Pedestal underscore UV. So it's my pedestal object UV map. So we're going to do that. So this looks perfect this time. JPEG format's going to be great. By default, it actually usually does a Maya IFF. Maya IFF is a Maya image format. This is still okay, and Photoshop will actually read these, but I want you guys to do a JPEG. There's a couple reasons for it. The big one is that a JPEG doesn't have an alpha, and so when you view the JPEG outside of Maya, like if you just double click on the image, because it doesn't have an alpha, it'll just look okay. If you save an image like an IFF or like a PNG that typically uses alpha channels, it's a little hard for you to view it because it'll like look like it's partially see-through, and it's just kind of a pain for me to grade it. So the good thing too about doing a JPEG is it's a really good way for me to show you a couple of ways we can use blend modes in Photoshop to get this to layer properly. So it's just kind of a good teaching moment. But JPEG, and we're doing 2048 by 2048. So that's just our width and height based on the project requirements. So if I come back here and just look at this thing, you can basically see I'm just doing the different steps we talked about over here, the very first part. Okay, and now we're going to go into Photoshop, load it up, and do all the fun stuff. All right, so we got to save. We are going to do tile 1-1, which basically just means it's doing this section right here, not any of the other areas around it. Okay, apply and close. So it worked. You get a little message down here, so it saved it. If you get an error, you can kind of look at it and try to figure out what happened, but it usually works. All right, let's just minimize all that. And we're going to go into Photoshop. I don't know. Yeah, we might come back in Maya actually, so I can at least show you how it looks on the surface. But let's go into Photoshop. Don't know why it's not pinned anymore, but that's all right. My Photoshop has been acting a little weird lately. I think I have like a driver issue, or I need to troubleshoot this. Mine has like kind of a lag where if I move around the canvas, it's sort of it's a little slow. So you may notice a little bit of an issue when I kind of pan around the canvas where it's a little laggy. But what I'm going to do is go to Open, and we're going to come back to the desktop. There's my folder, Source Images, Pedestal, UV. So we're just going to open up the image that we just saved earlier. Okay, so we're in Photoshop. Now currently inside of Photoshop, we are using, right here, we're using what's called standard screen mode. Standard screen mode basically just means it's the default layout. We have multiple tabs. If you have multiple images open, they all line up at the top. I don't mind standard. My issue with this one is that if you hold space, you can't move around the canvas, and I kind of like the ability to do that, like panning across the image. If you prefer to do that, like I do, you could use this one, which is called full screen mode with menu bar. It gets rid of the little tab at the top where you have multiple images open at once. You can still get to them by going through Window or using, I think it's Control Tab or Alt Tab. I think it might be Control Tab. It'll cycle through them, but I just like the ability to do this. You actually can probably see in the capture that kind of lag that's going on right now. That's the thing I'm trying to troubleshoot. I'm pretty sure it's a driver issue with NVIDIA and something I haven't probably updated properly inside of Photoshop. But you guys may notice it doesn't even do that with you, so it's probably not going to be an issue. Now I do want to zoom in. I'm just going to do Control Plus to get a little bit closer here. Let's back up. Okay, so inside of Photoshop, I'm kind of starting with my base image. It's currently starting as a background. It's locked. It's, kind of what we saw inside of Maya. Nothing too crazy. We're going to double click, and we're going to just do that so we can rename the layer and unlock it. So we're going to make a new layer. We're going to call this UV, or UV layer. Something, name it something pretty obvious, so if you have a lot of layers in here, you know which one has the UVs on it, just so it's easier to find later. Okay, and I want to find couple images we can use to kind of place in here. So on the site, I've got some different resources you guys can go through: Pexels, free stock textures, Texturify, Texturize, or Google. Google's also great. We're going to use Pexels. I've used this quite a bit. So let's think what type of textures we want to do here. How about we do let's do like a slate. That might be in here somewhere. Oh, sponsored photos? No, I don't think so. We're not paying for anything. Let me try doing stone and just see if anything comes up. These are kind of cool. I've used this one before. Some of these aren't too bad. A couple of them do have some fairly noticeable like surface detail where it's kind of bumpy. It might read okay inside of Maya, but technically if you wanted this to look right in Maya, we would actually have to model that into the surface or fake it with something called a normal map. And that's something we're going to talk about in week 4. It's a bit too much for this one. Well, that's cool. I like this one. I haven't used this one yet. Matt Hardy. All right, we're taking it. So if I click on it, Pexels is pretty cool where you can just free download it. It's going to want you to say thanks to Matt. Matt, if you're out there, we thank you for your contributions. I swear I will donate one day, but today is not that day. All All right, so we got that one, and let's try using Photoshop just so you can kind of get a feel for how this one works. So how about we do, let's try doing Slate Texture. Now the reason, I want to show you an example here in Photoshop, is the reason why I'm adding texture, not just Slate. So if you type in something very generic like Slate image, we might get lucky and it shows us what we want. Yeah, the problem with when you type in something that's just very broad like this is you're going to get pictures and photos of people doing things like this. Like they're taking pictures of Slate, but this isn't really useful for a texture because a texture needs to be very flat, sort of like you're looking head on onto the wall, onto the ground. You don't want to be getting like weird perspective and empty areas or highlights, a lot of bump detail. The color map really should be very, very flat. And even things like this I wouldn't want because that already has like lines, or grout, in between like all the tiles. I'm not doing a tiled effect. This isn't going to work. I really want to stick with something fairly basic here. Now, another thing that's going to help out is we'll also put texture on here because that's going to make a big difference. But we also want to go to tools. It's a kind of a cool trick if you haven't seen this before. In Google's images, if you go to tools, you'll see this little thing pop up, and you can actually search by color. Slate, we don't need to worry about searching for color because Slate is just Slate, but the size one's really cool. So size, if I go to large, what it's going to do is, I don't remember what the actual kind of threshold is it uses on what it filters out, but a lot of these textures are really tiny. Like that's only a 626 by 417. Remember, our thing in Photoshop is a 2048 by 2048. This guy is really small compared to that. So I want to find something that could at least fill the image. So if I go to large, it will probably do a pretty good job getting rid of most of the stuff that just is not going to work because the texture is just too darn small. And I don't know if we're going to find anything useful with Slate, but we're going to see if anything pops up. And some of these do have watermarks. Photoshop's a little or not Photoshop. Google's a little tricky because you kind of have to filter through a lot of crap, but eventually you might find something you like. Wow, Slate, we are getting all sorts of chunky detail. Let's not do Slate. We could also try marble, sandstone. Any of those would be good. I might just try marble and keep it simple. Like any of these are probably pretty decent. We'll do this guy. Why not? This one's actually pretty big, 2572 square. Okay, let's see if I click on it where it takes me. Sometimes you have to do a little trickery. Yeah, I'm going through about a million links to get there. We found it. So I did get to the image eventually by clicking through a couple things, including Pinterest, which is kind of cool. Pinterest is another one that's really good for this, actually. You can also use this and go through a ton of great stuff on here, and you might find something else that works really well. I actually need to include Pinterest on my links. That one's also really cool. But we got our image. We're going to save all this stuff. So I've got one downloaded in the downloads folder. I'm just going to move this in the downloads folder too for now, and then we'll move it later. So save image. Let's do downloads. This is fine. I'll rename it in a second. Okay, we've got our photos. I'm going to leave this open though because we're going to have to come back here in a little bit. And what I want to do real quick is back in my Explorer windows, I want to go back in the pedestal texture folder, and I immediately want to go to downloads, and we're going to move these guys in here so I can keep my original textures for the pedestal in the same location. All about that organization. So let's just move those guys over. Now, I'm not really too worried about renaming these because we're not really going to use them. You can rename them if you want. It's totally up to you. You could call it like marble reference, and I don't remember what this was. This might have also been marble. Who knows? But whatever that thing was, is another reference image. Now, I do want to open these up. Now, you want to be careful. Don't drag these into Photoshop. This is a weird importing thing, and anytime you drag it into a document that's open, Photoshop generally does a pretty terrible job at importing it properly. The scale is going to be off. You're going to lose a lot of detail. Just from being scarred from this process many years, because it always messes it up, I like to open them first and then copy it over. So we're going to do both these. Right click and I have to do it one at a time, sorry. Open with Photoshop, go back here, open with Photoshop, because it's not going to open with Photoshop by default. Okay. This is kind of interesting. It's actually a lot bumpier than I thought when I first looked at it, but I think if we still put it on there, it might still look cool, so we're gonna roll with it. All right, we got our two textures. Now, how do I get those over here? What I'm gonna do is we're gonna do a couple hotkeys in a row. So I'm holding down Control, and I'm gonna do, while Control's down, I'm doing A, C, D, so in sequence. So basically Control A, Control C, Control D. Now what those hotkeys are doing is Control A is select all. You can probably barely see that little selection box around the whole image. So Control A, Control C, that's the easy one, right? That's copy. And Control D, which is the one that people forget, is deselect. And the reason why I'm deselecting is because if you forget to deselect something in Photoshop, this little tricky bugger will, Photoshop acts differently when selections are still running. You're going to notice paint buckets don't work, and you're making alphas, and you didn't even mean to. So I always want to deselect something when I'm done. Now, since I've already copied it, if I go back here, if I just do Control V to paste, there it is. And it's a pretty big image. It's actually even bigger than my document. Again, that lag is a little crappy, but I think you guys still kind of get the idea. So we're just going to go back to this guy. Let's do the same hotkeys. Control A, C, D, go back. Control V to paste. Oh, this guy is massive. Holy crap. So I'm going to do Control T. Control T is free transform. If I click in here, you can see this thing is so big that it goes way off the screen. So what I'm going to do for this one is just grab a corner. And one thing I'll show you a little trick with this. In Photoshop, if you grab a corner, see how it kind of is scaling down to the opposite corner? Sometimes what you want to do is scale to the center. There's actually like a pivot point right here somewhere. You can't see it. But if I hold Control, or so not Control, Alt, and do this, this is going to scale to the pivot, which is kind of in the middle. So now I can just do this. Maybe something like this looks pretty good. And actually, I think for this one, since I'm going to do this in a couple areas, I actually might make this guy even a little smaller than I need to. So I'm thinking we do this for, let's do this for the side, and I'm going to use the white for the cap on the top and the bottom. Okay, so I generally know where I'm going to put it. Now, the problem is, right now, see how all the images are layering over each other, and it's very difficult to line stuff up. So let's hit apply. We're going to fix this. What we want to do, first let's rename our layers. We're going to double click. We're going to call this marble layer. I don't know actually what this was anymore. We'll call it swirly layer. Can't remember the rock type. And I want to take the UV layer and actually put it above everything. And you might think that's a weird decision, because when you put the UV layer above everything, obviously we can't see it, right? If I turn the visibility off, you can see the UV layer is covering what we're trying to do. I can't see where to line it up. Now the trick is, if we take the blend mode of the UV layer, and if you change through these, you'll notice that some of these blend modes kind of allow you to see through it a little bit. And the ones I like to use are going to be either add or screen. They're very, very similar. They're just lightening the image. So the black part of the UV layer disappears and the white part is visible. So it's a really cool trick where, because the black is the number 0, and screen and linear dodge or addition, there's basically some math happening behind the scenes where the black 0 adds onto what's beneath it. When you add 0 to anything, it doesn't change anything. So it's kind of this weird little trick where it acts like it can see through it. It's a lot of numbers and math. I'm not going to bore you with that stuff, but I have a whole video where I talk about it in the playlist. Let's just do add and kind of leave it at that. Now it's pretty good. I can at least see through to the texture now. And here's where we get into our first magic trick. This wasn't really one of the magic tricks. This is pretty basic. Our first trick is, even if I went to this layer, and let's say that we did line it up where we want, and I know it's probably, maybe we like this part of the texture here, but if I want the whole thing in it, I could do Control T again and scale it down even more so it's like more of the texture is visible. on that piece. That's fine too. And then maybe we go to the marble, and I'm just going to line it up for these pieces over here. So again, there's nothing wrong with leaving it this size, but if I wanted to have more of the cracks in here, because you have to kind of almost remember too, when you put this in Maya, how big some of these cracks are going to look visually. So you have to kind of think of scale and like, okay, how big is this crack in real life? What is this going to do inside of Maya? But if I wanted to scale this down a little bit more, we could do Control T and hold Alt, click in the corner, move it. I'm going to do Shift, click in the corner to rotate it maybe. And I might want to get some of those bigger crack chunks visible. That'd be kind of cool. Something like that. So I'm kind of doing some really rough placement, which is fine. This isn't, overly exciting. Now, the cool thing here is that there's a way to actually clean up this mess that's kind of forming. Because you can see, like, they're overlapping. And just look how messy this is. Like, there's, like, empty space down here. If you turn the UV layer off, this is not a really pretty looking texture. It's just like two images next to each other in a PSD document. It's kind of boring, right? What I can do, though, is if on the UV layer, check this out. What if I go to the magic wand? We're going to go to this guy. And some of you may have used this before. And what I'm going to do is on this layer, because I'm on the UV layer, I'm going to click in the black and watch what happens. Now it's doing a selection of all the black color on that particular layer. We're getting a nice little selection of everything. And what I'm going to do is offset the selection by a couple pixels, because eventually we're going to remove all the texture information in this negative space around the UVs. Because if the UV isn't there, like in this open area, we don't need a texture here. This can just be a solid color, and it would look a hell of a lot cleaner. So we're almost like trying to make a stencil. So when I do my selection, I can go up to Select. I'm going to go to Modify, Contract my selection, and I'm just going to offset it by 5 pixels. It's really hard to probably see what happened. I'm going to try to show you. You can kind of see how the selection has kind of pushed itself off the edge of the UV shell. Before it was like butting up right against it. I'm just giving it a little bit of a gap so the stencil isn't too close to the shell. Now, what we're going to do is, this is still running, so I'm not getting rid of the selection, but we're going to come down here to the layer. We're going to hit New Layer. And I'm going to move the layer below my UV layer. So UVs are still on top. I have an empty layer. The selection's still running. I haven't done anything with it yet. I'm going to call this layer Stencil. Now, what we're going to do is, with this layer selected, and I sold my selection in the canvas, there's a button down here that looks like a little square with a black circle. This is a mask. This is a layer mask. This is one of my favorite things in Photoshop, and once you guys get really comfortable with the concept of masking, whether it's in Photoshop, ZBrush, Painter, Designer, Nuke, mask is always a mask. It does the same thing in every software, so it's a very universal concept. It's basically like an alpha, but when you sort of understand how masks work and what white means, what black means with a mask, you can do some amazing things with them with other softwares. They're really fun. Now for this one, if I hit the button with the selection running, watch what happens to the layer. So I hit it, and a couple things happened. One, in our canvas, the selection disappeared. It deselected on its own. But if you look at the layer, look what happened over here. This thing appeared. This is the mask, and it's black and white, but you can kind of notice, even by the little preview there, that the mask has these black shapes that look exactly like the shapes of the UV shells. Now what happened is, I'll show you what it looks like. Actually, if I do Alt and click on it, it'll show you the preview. You can also get to it by just going to your channels and turning on the visibility of the mask and turning that off. But this is what the mask looks like. It's a black and white representation of what I had selected. So anytime that you click the mask button and a selection is active, Photoshop thinks you're trying to turn your selection into a mask. And again, think of mask like an alpha. White is where it's going to be visible on the layer. Black is where it's not visible. So visible, not visible. Now, if I go back to color, you can see it doesn't seem like it's doing anything, right? If I turn the layer on and off, nothing's happening. Why did we waste our time doing this? It's because even though I have an alpha here, the layer it's connected to is empty. We never put anything on it. So check this out. As soon as I pick my color, and it doesn't matter what we pick. Well, I guess it does a little bit. I mean, don't do something crazy like hot pink, but some kind of neutral tone, so it's nothing too crazy on the eyes, like a gray. If I go to Paint Bucket, G. By the way, all these guys have hotkeys, and if you kind of click on them, you'll see they all show you the hotkey on the side. If you want to get to a subtool or another tool in the list, because they all say G, and if I do G, see how it doesn't go to the other ones? How do I get to these other ones that have G, like gradient? If you do Shift, it will cycle through it. So Shift G will cycle through the tools in that button. Just in case you didn't know, that'll save you a little bit of time. So I'm on Paint Bucket. I'm just going to click in the canvas on the color part or the RGB channels of the layer and watch what happens. You'll notice that it is basically painted all over and around those guys. Now, I'm actually not sure why it is not doing the top. This actually might be my... Oh, that is totally my canvas freaking out. That is weird. Let me go to full screen. Oh, my Photoshop is having a bad time. There we go. Oh my goodness. I'm hitting F to go to my different screen modes. My Photoshop is not doing well. It actually is cutting it out properly. For some reason, in some of my view modes, it was looking like it was being cut off at the top. But it is working. So it's now stenciled out everything. And if you turn the UVs off, you actually can kind of see what it looks like, because eventually we don't want these visible. We really just made these just as a very quick guide, and so I could make the stencil. Once we're done with that, I don't really need the UV layer on at all. I can just leave it disabled. And now we can see our cutout of where we have empty space, where textures don't need to be, and I have a really good visual guide of the different pieces that made up that 3D shape we had inside of Maya. So what we can do now is go back to this. I can tell, all right, this one's in a good spot. It's being cut out right here. So what I can do is then go to, we're going to make a mask for this guy. We're going to do a marquee. I'm going to drag over this little piece right here, this layer. I'm going to use this to cut out that. I'm going to hit the mask button on that right there. That also cut it out. Now for this, this one actually is a little small. I shouldn't have scaled it down so small. Let's just boost it up a little bit. Okay, so that fills it. Now see how this one also overlaps down here? So square marquee selection, rectangular marquee. We're just going to drag over this part here. And by the way, if you ever need to adjust a selection, like let's say you did a terrible job and you want to go around the whole thing, you can do select, transform selection, and then you can just grab your corners and scale that out to the right size. Sometimes it's a lot easier than trying to line it up in the right spot. I'm holding shift and just bringing it into the sides. Okay, so we'll apply the selection. This looks great. I'm on my marble layer. I'm gonna hit the mask. It's now masked this section out. Now the marble's only visible here. So you can almost see where I'm building these little alphas to control where things are showing up. The mask for the gray paint, the mask for the little swirly texture in the right corner. Then we got our other one over here for the marble. And we would just repeat that through the other ones. Oops, turn that mask off. There we go. And we would do that down here. I'm not going to do the other one right now. I'm not going to move stuff around just because I kind of want to move into other things. But eventually when you get your textures and layers duplicated, you'll fill this area with more marble. This will probably be that same texture over here. Or you could do a different one if you want. And we would save it out. Now, just for right now, what I'm going to do is just fill this in with another color in this area so there's something there. We'll just do something obnoxious. Yellow, wonderful. So we're just going to put that there for now as a placeholder. But I'm going to save my PSD document. And let's put that in the same folder. So we're going to go to source images, pedestal. And we'll call this just pedestal. This is our pedestal PSD document. Now, the texture you're bringing back in Maya is not going to be the PSD document. The thing we're doing here with the layers, this is only for Photoshop. You don't want to be bringing PSDs back into Maya. They're massive. And Maya actually can read them. We used to do this years ago, but they're really clunky. It's unnecessary to bring these massive images in there. So we're going to also save it as another format that's a little bit easier for Maya. So we're going to do save as, and we're going to do one that's pretty light. I'm going to do a PNG. Now, it's still going in the same folder, but we're going to name this. We're going to call it pedestal texture. So I'm aware, looking at it, that this is my final texture. PNG, save it. We're going to leave all that default. And I'll show you what this looks like outside of Maya. So our pedestal folder looks like this. I got the reference images. I got the UV thing I did from Photoshop or from Maya. I got the PSD document for my work. So this is what I'm using in Photoshop currently to edit and control everything. But this guy, this is the one that we're going to bring back inside of Maya. And I'll connect that real quick so you can see it. Then I'll try to move on to the other one real quick. All right, if we wanted to apply it, let's apply a texture to these guys. So I'm going to do something very similar to what we did back in the first week and what we did in 2.1. I have all those objects selected. If you don't have them selected, just reselect them. And on the render man shelf, we're going to right click and make a Pixar surface material. Okay, so with those selected, when I make a Pixar surface, that's automatically making a material and assigning it to whatever I had selected. Now to show you that, if I go in the Hypershade, there's the material, Pixar Surface 2. That was created when I hit that button. Now I want to make sure this is assigned. So how do we verify it's assigned? Hold your right mouse button over the material and say, I want to select the objects currently using this material. Select objects with material. It'll show you in Maya what is lighting up. So this is a really cool way to verify visually that this is what you think it's supposed to be on. Like, I do this all the time if I'm not quite sure if I've like accidentally assigned the wrong material to the wrong object. Again, right mouse button, select objects with that material, boom, there it is. It looks correct. Now, I want to rename it because Pixar Surface 2 is kind of a stupid name. So we'll do Control, double click, which is a rename shortcut. I'm going to call this pedestal material. You can also rename this, by the way, which a lot of people do, is they click on the material and then in the attribute editor, most people probably name it up here. That's at the top of the node in the attribute editor. It's the same thing. I just like my little shortcuts. Now let's render it and just try to get the texture on there. So we're going to go back to the camera. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start the render, and before I do the texture, because it's going to be on these two posts right here, I want to get some really basic material properties in there. And I'm going to focus on one object at a time, because if I get one working, I know the other one's going to be fine. And I don't know which one is the yellow one, but we're going to find out. I'm going to do a crop in the render man viewport. I'm going to draw over this section right here. So it's only going to render the one little piece, so it's going to be a lot faster. Now let's just see. If I bring up my primary specular values, you can kind of see how it's getting shiny. See how it's like reflecting stuff around it? All those little lines you're seeing on the pedestal, that's actually reflecting the little posts going around the balcony. I just want to give it a little bit of a highlight, and just to change the colors, you can see it does work. Like, it's changing to a green. So right now we have a weird kind of green plastic. Now the green, or whatever this color is, this is where the texture is going to go. I don't want it to be a green color. I want to use that thing I just did in Photoshop. So let's just like turn the crop off for a second. I'm going to turn the render off completely. And I'm going to go to the little checker button on the right, and we're going to pick File. So what that did, and again, all I did is I clicked on that checker button. It's not there now because I already put something in it, but you hit it and you're going to pick the file option when that window pops up. This is what it's doing in the Hypershade. So because when you're doing a lot of these things in Maya, it's like doing things in other windows that you're not really seeing sometimes. So that pedestal material, I want to graph it out because I want you to see this. If you right mouse button over the material and graph the material network, you'll kind of get a better idea what is really happening. Now, come on. Oh, there we go. That might pop a little bit in the live stream. My computer just kind of froze up for a couple seconds. Um, in the Hypershade, a material network is really, really similar to how Nuke works. And I know most of you haven't used Nuke too extensively yet, or at all. But Nuke is a node editing software. This is still the same idea. It's still connecting things together in a node tree. The big difference between the Hypershade and Nuke is Nuke reads like top down. It's sort of like having a Christmas tree stand up on it upside down, where it's very wide at the top and it funnels together in like a cone until you have one image at the end. The Hypershade is something where it shows you from left to right, like you're reading a book, how things connect into the material. Now, this is a fairly basic node graph right here, where there's a material, there's a texture, which is the file going into the material's diffuse color. That's this attribute right here. So it just shows me something is going into that material's color attribute. Now, when I click on the file and hit the little open button over there, we're going to go to the pedestal. I'm going to choose my pedestal texture, load it, and we're going to find out which one we're looking at. I don't know if this is the yellow one or the other one, but we should find out pretty quick. If I hit render, okay, oh, that's the yellow guy. Okay, there's the other one over there. So of course I did the wrong one according to the render, but that's fine. You actually can see it over here on this one. It's working. Now if I go to my camera, like a perspective, and just move this guy over here, it'll be a little bit easier to see. So I'm just going to use the perspective camera, render. That's actually kind of cool looking. And let's just drag over that. I really like the one in the middle. I know it had a lot of weird bumpy detail, but like even though it's kind of flat and the bumps don't look believable, it sort of feels like it's this weird painted effect. I like this a lot more than I thought I was going to. Now I think the top and the bottom have a couple problems because they're just very bright, but I like the middle quite a bit. Now in this case, I can see the textures working. What I want to do is go back to the material and just darken the color. So actually, let's do this in the Hypershade. I'm just going to click on the material here, and we're going to bring down that diffuse gain attribute right above where we put the texture. And you'll kind of notice it darkens things down. And visually, what I'm just trying to do is just get it so the top isn't so blown out. It's very, very bright compared to everything else in the project right now. Something like that just feels a little bit more balanced to me. Sweet. Now you can kind of see from this angle too, like what the reflections look like. See how shiny that thing is? It's not a big deal, but if you don't like that amount of shininess on it, we can sort of change the roughness. I can pull down the face color. You can see how that's affecting the highlight, like how bright that thing's going to be. I might pull this back. And the roughness, what that does, as a kind of a recap, because we've talked about this a little bit, roughness is how sharp or blurry the reflection looks. So think of it kind of like polished, which is low roughness, to like a very dry, like a concrete on the other extreme. So if I have it very, very, very low, it's going to give me really tight, almost wet, like mirror-looking reflections. But if I bring it up, you're now drawing out the reflection where it starts to look a little bit more diffused and matte. So you'll find the kind of the balance you want to use for this thing. Just depends what type of look you're going for. But there's the material and the texture on there. So that's already one done. And we're basically going to be repeating that through a lot of the stuff for like this guy, the wall. Now, the wall and the balcony, we don't have to export out the UVs. For those, it's a little different. Whoops, I want that on. These guys do not need a UV snapshot. They're a little bit different here. Oh, that's actually 2.3, wrong project. That is this one. We already did 2.2. And 2.2, by the way, you don't have to bring it back in Maya. I kind of jumped ahead into week 3 to show you what it looked like. 2.2 is literally just you making the texture in Photoshop. This is the other one that kind of goes with it. So this is where we're doing the wall texture and the balcony texture. So I'm going to do the balcony one real quick to show you kind of how that works. And I'll show you visually what the wall looks like. But the main idea is we're trying to get some kind of more complex layered textures by stacking a few things together. This is an example of my wall texture that I created where I've got like blue paint, going over kind of like a stucco or a concrete kind of background. I've layered dirt and other things on top of it. But this isn't me hand painting anything. I'm literally pulling all this from other images I found. I'm not doing any hand painted stuff at all, if I can avoid it. Is my stream still buffering pretty good for you guys, by the way? Because I'm noticing on my little indicator in YouTube that the stream health looks like it's pretty terrible. So I might have some bad bandwidth. Hopefully you guys can still see and hear me. All right. Let's very quickly do a tileable texture. I'm going to do a search for like sandstone. Let's do sandstone texture. Yeah, these all actually look pretty bad. So what I'm going to do is go to Google. Let me refresh my YouTube page as well. Hopefully it's not crashing for everybody. Yeah, that buffer's not looking too good. That's okay. So I'm just going to find a nice texture. Tools, large. These are all pretty decent. We can try using that one. That one's not too bad. We'll try it out. Okay. So I found an image I think I can use. See if I can actually find it if I click on it. Oh, jeez. I can right click. If I do open image, a new tab, this might work. Oh, that works. Okay. One thing that I can kind of do here, sometimes when you click on an image in Google, it'll take you to a weird site and you can't quite navigate to the right image. I'm glad it's actually streaming well for you guys because it's looking alarmingly poor on my meter. I can actually see what the video's doing on your end, and for me it's absolutely terrible. But if you ever feel like the image and the link doesn't take you to the right section and you're fighting like ads and banners and it wants you to pay for something, we're going to bypass that. If you right click on it and do open image, a new tab, a lot of times it'll take you right to the image in the page and you can sort of skip past all the crap that the page is throwing at you. So this is going to be our tileable texture. Now I'm going to make it, or I'm going to save it into a folder like before. We're going to kind of zip through this one since we're getting near the end. But if we go into source images, this would be the balcony in this case. But balcony, we'll just say sandstone texture, sandstone original. And yeah, JPEG's fine. It's all good. We're going to change this anyway. All right. Now, the one thing that's going to be different about this one, we'll kind of close out of all this stuff. And I don't need this open anymore either. We obviously would have finished this, before we got to 2.3. But let's make a new document. Now, I'm not going to open the sandstone texture up yet. What I'm going to do is go to File, New, and I'm going to define a size for this. This is a little bit different because remember when I did the UV snapshot, I started with the UV snapshot in Photoshop, which is a 2048 by 2048. I'm not really starting with anything this time because I don't have a snapshot coming out of Maya. So what I want to do first is immediately define what size this texture I'm making is supposed to be. What do I need to do? And typically when you're making textures, you're doing them in powers of 2, like a 256 by 256, 512 by 512, 1024, 2048, 4096. You've probably heard of a lot of these numbers before, but in this case, we're doing a 2048 by 2048. Pretty average size texture. And we'll just hit create. Okay, so this is a 2048 by 2048, just kind of white canvas. And we'll just double click in the background. We'll leave that there for now. And I'm going to open up our texture. So open with Photoshop. And we're going to do the same shortcuts as before. Control A, Control C, Control D. So I've just basically copied it. We're going to go back over here to our kind of empty canvas. Control V, paste it. I accidentally hit Control, I think, V or B in here as well, and I brought up a color correction tool. Now, this one's kind of interesting because I brought it in and notice how it's not really big enough. So I got a texture from Google that's not the right size, and I don't want to scale this up because if I scale it up, it's going to try to create detail that's not there because this image is only as good as the original photo. And me scaling it up isn't magically making more pixels. It's going to get kind of blurry when I do that. So instead, what we might try to do is tile this a couple times. So I'm going to take this layer and let's actually move it up here in the corner. It'll kind of snap into place. I'm going to drag the layer down to the new layer button, which is a really cool way to make a copy. And now we can use, I'm just using V, which is just the move tool. We're just going to move this around a little bit. And I'm not really going to line them up perfectly in a grid because it's a little too obvious when you do it that way. And I might change the layer order where some are like stacked behind. We can use Control T, or I could flip it a couple times and do something like this. I'm just trying to get a really sort of quick and dirty fill of putting this texture in different corners to fill the entire shot. So you can play with layer order. You can kind of move them around in different positions. We'll maybe do this one more time. Let's take this guy and put that over here possibly. So for the most part, it's pretty good. I can just do this a couple more times just to fill these leftover little sections. I'll put this one behind it. Again, Control T. Great. Let's actually move that over just a little bit more. And we're going to clean up all those lines in a second. And let's take the last one down here and do that. Okay, that looks wonderful. Now, it's not like very clean, but this is going to be totally fine for what we're doing. So I'm going to take all the layers, and what we're going to do is put it in a group. So I'm hitting this little group button. We're going to call this original group. Okay. And now that I have it in the group, I need to immediately clean up all the seams and make it tileable. Now, one of the problems here is that these images are going off the screen. So I need to make a duplicate of the group where it's a flattened texture that doesn't go outside of the canvas. What I mean by that is some of these textures, like this one right here, is you can kind of see if I move it, it's actually going off the screen somewhere, and that is going to be a problem. So we're going to take the whole group, drag this to a new layer, and I'm going to take this duplicated group and then do a flatten. So it's going to flatten the entire, whoops, not that flatten, sorry, flatten merge group, which is also flatten those layers into one layer. Let's just hide the other group below it. We're going to do Control A to select everything, and I'm going to do a crop, which is basically trimming the fat outside of what was the canvas. Now I can clean it up and make it tileable. I'm going to do all the lines first. So the trick to make it tileable, which means we get rid of some of the lines so it can repeat infinitely forever, is if I make a new layer above it, I'm going to call this tile layer. And what we're going to do is go over here to let's do the heel brush. Now the heel brush, we're going to bring the size down a little bit. It's right clicking to get to this thing. Let's go down a little bit lower. Oops, sorry. Actually, let's do the spot heel instead. Get these guys mixed up constantly. Spot heel is kind of interesting because you can basically just click through it, and if we're going to have it set to all layers, it's kind of magical when you see it work. I'm going to zoom in here so you can really get the full effect. So I have some pretty bad lines, right? And if I simply am on a new layer above it, empty, and if the spot heel brush is set to sample all layers, watch what happens when I just click through these little lines where it looks kind of bad. You can see where it's almost trying to patch in the areas and fill it with a new part of the texture. Now the tricky thing with this sometimes is you have to play around with your brush scale and flow to kind of get it to look right. So at the moment, I think my scale is a little too small. So if I go up a little bit and then just simply click and drag over it, it'll fill in some of the information, and I'm going to start cleaning up some of the lines. And it does take a little trial and error to get this to look right. You may end up like, messing it up, and you have to kind of redo it with a couple different attempts. But we're just going to do it really quick and dirty here. And hopefully when you guys get a texture, you're not actually finding one that is that small. It might have been a better idea for me to go back on Google and find an image that had a lot more resolution. So this is not looking too bad. We'll do that. And if I make it pretty big, we could do like a broader patch that maybe just cleans up a couple of the more obvious lines we have in here. So maybe I'll just draw over this with a bigger brush. Give it a second. That actually kind of worked. Draw over that. I'm just kind of lightly tapping with my heel brush. And over any of the areas, it just seemed like they are a little bit too noticeable of a line. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but I want to show you like the before and after. Like here is without it. See the little lines? This is what the heel brush is filling in. And it didn't take much time, right? Like, it's kind of incredible, like, how simple this could be. There's definitely some areas where up close it's not holding up as well as I would have hoped, but it's still not too bad. Okay, now the last thing we want to do, and let's just back up here. Now that I've cleaned this up, I'm going to actually flatten this into a one image again. I'm going to take that clone layer, or the heel layer, with that one below it, and we're going to do merge layers. So now I've combined these into one layer, and this is where we get the tileable part. So I do want to show you, I know we're going over a little bit, so I appreciate you guys just kind of hanging out with me for a second, but I just really want you to understand what this tileable thing is before we get out of here. You guys have all seen tileable textures before. If you've played any video game, you have been surrounded by them. So Minecraft is actually a really good example of that. But tileable texture is this. It's a texture that can basically, if you put it next to itself, it will look like it repeats forever. This one's a little hard to see, but that stone right there, that's probably the other end of it right here. It just goes on forever. It tiles. Let me see if I can find one in a game. Yeah, like these are tileable. You actually can see the repeating pattern, like brick, grass, and terrain's very common. Like this type of stuff. These are all tileable. Now some of these aren't very good tileable textures, but they're still tileable. We're trying to do that with this one here. We want their texture to repeat infinitely, so when I'm using this inside of Maya, it gives me a little more flexibility with how I move the texture around. Because the issue, like when I did the pedestal, I did it with a very specific method to make sure the marble's here, the slate is here. I'm doing a very controlled type of texture. A tileable texture, because it repeats forever, it means in the 3D software, you can kind of move it around and slide it into different positions, and it doesn't really ever break. So it kind of gives you some artistic freedom back in Maya or the Unreal Engine or wherever you're bringing it you can kind of play around with the composition and placement of the texture. To worry about the UVs like we did previously. But the thing I want you to kind of see is in Photoshop, there's a way to check if the tiling is working. So the tiling, the way to see it is, since this is a 2048 by 2048, if you go up to Filter, Other, Offset, and if you offset it by half the width and height, so 1024, this is what it's doing is shifting the image halfway across and up, and it's repeating on like vertically and horizontally, and you can kind of see what the edges look like. So if we didn't clean it up, this is what would happen if it tiled in Maya or in a game engine. See how those edges would show up? We're trying to get it so the edge of this image matches that side, so it can repeat in all directions forever. It currently doesn't do that. So how do we fix it? What we got to do is go up here. We're going to do the offset, okay, by half. There's a reason why I'm doing that, but we're going to do exactly half. Hit OK. And we're going to do the same thing we just did a second ago. New layer, heel brush, and I'm just going to simply drag through the middle. Give it a second. Drag through the middle. See how it kind of cleaned it up? Again, not perfect, but for 20 seconds is pretty good. So this is the heel brush cleaning up the edges. Still can kind of see it, but we're going to go with it. We're then going to take the two layers, layer, flatten them again. So I'm combining the heel into that layer. I'm going to do Control A. I'm going to also crop, because I think my heel brush actually went off the canvas a little bit. Sometimes that can cause some issues. So we're going to crop to get rid of any excess fat that was kind of outside the canvas. And remember how I did that 1024 offset? The reason I did that is because if for some, I mean, I could leave it like this, but if for some reason I wanted to get it back to where it was, if I do exactly the same offset, it'll pop back to the original position. Because if I offset it by 1024 and then offset it again by 1024, it goes back to where it was originally. And it's kind of cool because if I use that same offset tool and slide the thing, like if I go back to 0 and just shift it, you can kind of see it, what it looks like when it repeats. Say you don't really see the edge of the texture, that's tileable. And we started with something that was definitely not tileable. It was terrible. We actually had like a dozen small images piecemealed together, and then we still got it to work. And this isn't even that good of a job, and if you guys spend more time on it, you're going to probably end up with something a lot better than this thing. But this is our final texture in this case. Not too bad. So I can then, I didn't even save my PSD document, which is kind of crappy, but we're going to do it anyway. Totally forgot to do that. So this would be balcony. This is for the balcony in the scene. And then we would do save as. I would do my balcony texture. So just like we did before with like the PNG, we're just doing the same thing here for this one. This is balcony texture, PNG. We would connect it just like we did before. And the other kind of cool thing here too, which I'll just do super quick, is even though you're going to get through the color map probably pretty effectively, it's not really going to be too difficult. And there's a couple examples of other ones I've done. This one we didn't get into, but I have a video that goes into how to do this. Eventually you're doing this, and the normal map, what this is going to do is this is going to, it means it's going to take your balcony texture we just built, and it's going to give it the bumpiness. Because remember, inside of Maya, all the objects are actually very, very flat, but some of the textures we're using need to have those little like cracks and bumps and surface details. This is actually what a normal map does, is it fakes all those little imperfections and puts it into the surface. So it's almost like a visual trick instead of you physically sculpting every little, nook and cranny into this thing. Now there are a lot of ways to do normal maps. I'll just do it really quick in here so you can kind of see it, and then we'll get out of here. If you want to do a normal map, you're going to go to Filter, 3D, and I'm doing it on the flattened layer, by the way. We're going to do Generate Normal Map. So you do this after you're like done with your texture, but we just click it. Wait, that might be why my Photoshop is actually messed up. Wait a second. Did I just solve my problem? Is it not using my graphics card? Wait a second. Oh my goodness. Did I seriously just fix it? No, doesn't seem like it. Let me see if that works actually. If this doesn't work, I'll have to troubleshoot it later, and oh, that actually does seem like it's going to work. That was weird. Wasn't using my graphics card. But basically, this makes a normal map. You actually can kind of see it. It does this little preview on like a little shader ball. It's going to generate all those bumps. And eventually, when you're going to do this, you don't have to change anything. Just default's fine. Hit OK. Don't save the PSD document like this, by the way, because you don't want to lose the original texture. But you save this out as a normal texture, just File, Save As. It's just like we did before. PNG. The only difference is I just don't want to override the previous one. I'm going to call this balcony normal. But this guy's kind of interesting. In week 3, I'm going to show you how to use it. But on the material, like we know how before when I did the pedestal, all I did was really connect that color texture, and I had a couple like really rough like specular reflections on it. This, if I use it on the balcony material, it's going to actually make it look bumpy. Like when you do the render, you will actually see bumps and little dents all over this guy when it's connected. And we're going to leave that for week 3 but that's why we're generating all this stuff in week 2. So a lot of texture creation for the wall, balcony, pedestal. Connecting inside of Maya goes in week 3, but really all you're doing to Sunday is just spending a lot of time refining these. And I would recommend, for anyone that watches this thing, make a couple of versions. Don't stop at just what's required. Play around with different paint colors for the wall, do different pedestal textures, try a couple of versions for the balcony. You can turn them all in if you want to, but I want to make sure you guys have some options. So when you get it back in Maya in week 3, if it turns out that individually the textures look good, but when you see them together, if it's a little bit of a mess because the colors are fighting with each other and it's not quite what you were hoping, it'd be nice to have some other variations so you can at least swap things in and out and kind of play around with different ideas for how the colors combine together. But eventually, when they're connected, they will look like, so I can find it, kind of like this. So it's, you can actually see all the little bumps all over the wall. That's the normal map. This is an example of one I did. There's some other stuff we'll talk about in week 3 too, like applying paint to specific parts of the UVs and some other little tricks, but you'll have something kind of similar to this. And we're just sort of building upon this going into week 4. We're going to do some subsurface scattering. We'll talk about glass, windows, and before we know it, we're going to be done with the activity and the month is over. But yeah, that's it. We went way over time. So that's it, guys. Appreciate everybody kind of hanging out and bearing with me on this one. I know it's a little bit of a doozy, but it's Photoshop. It's fun. It's drawing. It's paint. Everybody should like this stuff. So have fun with the activity. Play around with the textures, and I'm looking forward to seeing how all this stuff turns out once you guys get that applied back inside of Maya. If you have any questions, hit me up on Discord, and I hope everybody has a good night.